Welcome to everyone joining us. My name is Marty Blatt. I'm an emeritus professor of public history at Northeastern University, and I served as the chair of the NCPH Book Award Committee for 2022. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Dan Hicks, who's professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford and curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum. He is the author of a wonderful book, which our committee selected as the 2022 award winner. And the name of the book is The Brutish Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence, and Cultural Restitution. This was published by Pluto Press in 2020. And I'm going to share with you now the statement our committee drew up in terms of in making this award. Hicks writes with power, intelligence, passion, and anger about the important topic of looting the colonial world and then continuing this violence by putting the stolen objects on display in museums. He declares that the brutish museums, such as the Pitt Rivers, where he works, quote, have compounded killings, cultural destructions, and thefts with the propaganda of race science, with the normalization of the display of human cultures in material form. An act of dehumanization in the face of dispossession lies at the heart of the operation of the brutish museums, end quote. Hicks in the book examines the brutal, deadly British assault on Benin City, Nigeria in 1897, and the theft of countless objects which comprise the Benin bronzes, including thousands of brass plaques and carved ivory tusks. Subsequently, he explores in careful detail the disposition of the stolen objects across Britain and the world, although he's cautious to note the challenges in fully documenting the whereabouts of these materials. Hicks clearly articulates a call to action, arguing that, quote, Britain needs to come to terms with its Victorian colonial militarist past in a totally new way, and that anthropology museums offer spaces for doing this as sites of conscience and of restitution, reparation, and reconciliation, end quote. And he declares in his afterword that, quote, the reader has to write the conclusion by taking action, end quote. I love that. And Hicks provides a clear and concrete place to begin in one of his appendices where he identifies all of the museums, galleries, and collections worldwide that may currently hold objects looted from Benin City in 1897. Some institutions, including German state museums, British universities, and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art, has started to act. But there is much more that should be done, which Hicks argues in this provocative and compelling book. So now I'm going to turn to Dan Hicks, and thanks so much for joining me.
Okay, good to be here. Yeah.
Yes, and we're in a format that NCPH wants to set up of very brief, 60 to 120 seconds, something like that. So let me start with asking you, what is your professional background?
Okay, thank you, Marty. Lovely to be here. So yeah, I mean, I come from an intellectual but also a professional background that comes from across archaeology, the museums world, and anthropology, which I guess, you know, has sort of taught me about the importance of objects in everyday life, but also the importance of material culture to culture, you know. So many of us, I think, in the context of the movement for Black lives, for the ongoing civil rights movement that we see around us, have seen museums and anthropology and archaeology as spaces where maybe the debates going on there are a distraction from the real work of anti-racism. The book argues really fundamentally that culture and art was central to certain visions of white supremacy, and therefore that our museums and our universities find themselves as central locations for having these conversations that reckon with sort of those ongoing aspects of the past, you know, in the present. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And then let me follow that up with, how did you become involved in public history and what some might call, I would approvingly, a kind of radical public history?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, I think we're in a really interesting moment for these legacy institutions, the Colonial, you know, Anthropology Museum, you know, as it was established in the later 19th century. There's no doubt that we need these institutions more today than we ever have, as, you know, public spaces in which we're able to actually tell the stories and experience the different ways in which, you know, there are different forms of making, different forms of thinking, different forms of believing. But we find in these museums items that were taken with violence, that were displayed for the purposes of white supremacy, and where increasingly our audiences, our stakeholders, our communities, those people whom as institutions we say that we serve, you know, are increasingly aware of the idea that, well, maybe some of these items are things that someone somewhere is asking for back, and maybe we need to understand how they found their way here, and actually whether they should be on display, whether they should be in this location. So I think that sense of the museum as a public space is not one that the museum has always embraced, but it's one that history is now forcing upon us. So the crucial, you know, argument of the book really, you know, in terms of cultural restitution, is that we can no longer, you know, attempt to keep our head in the sand. The work of the curator in a museum is, of course, to keep things the same, to make sure that the items in our care are not sort of decaying and the fabric isn't eaten by moths and the ironwork isn't rusting away. But some curators have experienced a sort of mission creep through which they've imagined that their job is to stop the world from changing around the museum. That's no longer possible. And so the Brutish Museum's aims to put into practice what we and those who read the book can do. Fundamentally, the question is, how far are you right this moment from a looted African object? And actually, in terms of visiting your local anthropology museum, what role are you going to play in terms of helping objects which are subject to demands to be returned?
Well, that is terrific, and I want to thank you, Dan Hicks, for taking the time with me and for writing this wonderful book.
Okay, thank you so much.